In 1870, Potter Palmer, at age 44, married the 21-year-old daughter of a real estate magnate from Louisville, Kentucky, Bertha Honoré. He first noticed her shopping with her mother in his Lake Street store when she was 13. She now said she would be satisfied to be the wife of an innkeeper. The inn was the Palmer House, an 8-story hotel nearing completion on State Street, the tallest building in the city, and with 225 rooms, one of the largest hotels in the country. Palmer billed it as the only fireproof hotel in America. He imported chandeliers and candelabra from France and staffed the hotel, he announced with pride, with several hundred smartly uniformed Negroes. The Palmer House was Potter Palmer's wedding gift to Bertha. They would make it their in-town residence.
Hotels were a symbol of urbanity in late 19th century America, and I think the Palmer House is one of a whole series of Chicago hotels that brought the city reputation. Reputation is spread by travelers quite a lot, and it's the public facilities of a city, the railroad stations, the hotels, that would supply a lot of the reputation that they spread.
The years after the Civil War were boom years. In 1871, more vessels arrived in Chicago than any other city in America. More than 270 lumber boats every 12 hours. Ships heading for Bridgeport passed 13 miles of docks and 24 swing bridges. As soon as the bridge closes, the impatient crowd rushes madly on, wrote journalist Noah Brooks, giving a stranger the impression that they are an active race, given to gymnastics and slightly crazed. In less than 40 years, Chicago had grown from a fur trading post to a metropolis of 300,000. In 1871, a popular writer called this growth one of the most amazing things in the history of civilization. The colony Joliet had foreseen had come to command the continent. By October of that year, Chicago had suffered one of the worst droughts in memory, only an inch of rain since July 4th. Every day for a week, the fire bell rang from the courthouse. The fire department was exhausted. On the evening of October 8th, a strong wind from the prairies blew across the forest of shanties and mills at the southwest corner of the city. Bertha Palmer looked out the window of her country estate and saw a lurid orange and yellow curtain hanging in the night sky. The fire started around 9 at night in the barn of Mrs. Catherine O'Leary, a 38-year-old woman who ran a dairy business. Within hours, a rumor spread that Mrs. O'Leary brought a lantern to the barn and a cow kicked it over. The fire tore through a block of shanties on the west side. Flaming timbers were blown toward the south branch of the river, at furniture factories and grain elevators. People began to panic. Wretched females implored spectators to help them with their burden of bed quilts, cane-bottomed chairs, and iron kettles, a reporter observed. All was confusion. Before midnight, the fire leapt over the south branch of the river and hit the gasworks. The greasy river itself went up in flames.
If you examine the waterfront along the river, you have things like, 5 wooden buildings, a paint factory, a turpentine making plant, dry goods, throw in like 4 or 5 lumber yards. It was an accident waiting to happen.
This is a city that had been made out of the pine trees that had been cut in the North Woods. And so those trees now turned into buildings, sitting there in an arid landscape in a period of drought with high winds moving across the prairies. Yeah, there's something inevitable about a fire like that burning, and totally predictable.
The fire raced for the heart of the city, for the courthouse, where cascading sparks made it seem as if the city were hit by an illuminated snowstorm. A bell tolling to the end crashed through the ruins. It struck the Briggs Hotel, which George Pullman had jacked out of the mud. Marshall Field's sparkling marble store. Joseph Medill's Tribune building. Even the fireproof Palmer House. Within minutes, most of Chicago's landmark buildings were gone. The janitor at the Board of Trade saw it coming.
He took care of his family, then he rushed to the Board of Trade, to the vault, pulled out as many records as he could to save them, and he became one of the saviors of the Board of Trade.
A portrait of Frank Hudlin, the janitor, later adorned the board's Hall of Fame. Terrified crowds fled north toward the river.
There's a lot of curious things about the fire. You have these old wooden sidewalks. They're there to protect people from the mud. The leaves are underneath, and you have this wooden cover over there, and you have a wind coming underneath, which whipped the fire up very quickly. And so when the fire picks up, you have essentially an oven that's in the wooden sidewalks.
Bridges to the north side, cluttered by horses and wagons, became impassable. Burning wood was blown across the river and landed in a railroad car carrying kerosene.
The scariest thing about the fire was the wind that the fire created. Convection whirls, they were called. They spin and spin and spin, and you get this rising hot air and cool air going in there and creating a tornado effect. And then these tornadoes would come and they'd hit a building and it would give them a spin, and they'd take the roof off a building and deposit it a quarter of a mile away. And that's how the fire spread.
A burning timber tore through the pump house roof. The fire spread in all directions, devouring 11 blocks in an hour. The McCormick Mansion was destroyed, along with the more modest homes of the Germans. The McCormicks camped on the prairie, a contemporary noted, next to the lowliest vagabond and the meanest harlot. The wind was like a tornado, and I held fast to my little ones, one woman remembered. I thought the day of judgment had come. She huddled in the emptied graves of a cemetery, being converted to Lincoln Park. Throughout the night, thousands remained trapped by the lake north of the river, near William Ogden's lumber yards. At dawn, the lumber yard burst into flames. Then Ogden's Railroad, McCormick's Reaper Works. South of the river, the Illinois Central terminals. The sun disappeared. Such a scene of horror and terror, I cannot make you imagine, one woman trapped by the lake would write. The wind increased, straw blew, feather beds and blankets blazed, and even the people were on fire. She told her husband she would rather he drown her than let her burn to death. The Chicago Fire of 1871 was one of the great urban catastrophes of modern times. More than 73 miles of streets and 17,000 buildings were destroyed. 100,000 people, 1/3 of the population, were homeless. 125 bodies were recovered. Many others were vaporized or drowned and never found. The investments of two founding fathers, William Butler Ogden and Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, were in ruins. Tribune editor Joseph Medill was undaunted.
It's saying to people outside of Chicago, keep sending your money. Don't call in your debts right now. You'll get your money back. And it's also saying to the people who live in Chicago, stay. Don't go to Iowa. Don't go to St. Louis. Don't go to Milwaukee. There'll be jobs here soon. There are already a lot of jobs.
Chicago boomers and boosters are on trains the next day going out to the East Coast saying, hey, this is a great place to invest. We're not broke. We just had a little fire.
In New York to buy new presses, the Tribune's publisher, William Bross, exhorted investors. Help establish Chicago on a scale more gigantic and more profitable than ever before, he bellowed. You will never again have such a chance to make money. The optimism didn't last. A month later, the editor of The Nation asked Frederick Law Olmsted in Chicago to build a park to report on the devastation. For a time, men were unreasonably cheerful and hopeful, Olmsted wrote. Now this stage appears to have passed. No one could yet see, he added, how the city is to recover from this blow.
There's more about Chicago on American Experience.
The Chicago Fire of 1871 was one of the great urban catastrophes of modern times. Papers would boast that the Great London Fire of 1666 or Napoleon's Siege of Moscow in 1812 hadn't done half the damage. Chicago, its boosters believed, had to be first in everything. But railroads still converged on the city. The stockyards and hundreds of mills, factories, and warehouses that ringed the downtown had survived. Editor Joseph Medill cranked out an edition of the Tribune while the ground was still hot.
Chicago boomers and boosters are on trains the next day going out to the East Coast saying, hey, this is a great place to invest. We're not broke. We just had a little fire.
An inquiry at the time determined that one suspect, Catherine O'Leary, was not responsible, that she was in bed when the fire started, not in the barn with her cow. But within weeks, she was depicted as the culprit, not 38 years old, but an old hag. A published photo showed another woman with a steer, not a cow.
I've seen a few where she actually looks like a witch. You know, they've got the big nose with the, you know, the wart on her nose, and she actually looks evil in some of them.
She was a Catholic, she was an immigrant, she was poor, and most of all, she was a woman. She was the perfect patsy for the fire.
In truth, she was a very decent, honorable, hardworking lady who was trying to raise her family in very difficult circumstances.
They didn't want to lose their investors, and so it was easy to, I think, find a scapegoat and say, oh, well, we know the reason the fire started, and you know, these Irish were not clean, they were throwing their garbage out. This was just all made up. And most of them are burned out, too. They did say that they've moved out of the city, the slums are going to be cleaned up, we don't have to worry about them anymore. It was really a terrible thing for her to have to endure. She just died, I think, heartbroken.
One dark night when we were all in bed, Mrs. O'Leary put a lantern in the shed.
Mrs. O'Leary and her cow became one of America's most enduring legends.
A hot time in the old town tonight. Fire, fire.
Chicago sends its firemen's band, a Rose Parade favorite. They came along to prevent the city of Chicago from reenacting the incident of Mrs. O'Leary's cow. This float won the coveted national trophy.
In 1997, after 126 years, the Chicago City Council investigated the fire and formally absolved Mrs. O'Leary of responsibility.
And the true villain in this case was Peg Leg O'Sullivan, who broke into the O'Leary barn to steal milk from one of her cows to mix up a batch of whiskey punch, which was fueling a local gathering of some of the lads down the street from the O'Leary home.
The rubble was swept into Lake Michigan to create more real estate. Chicago began to rebuild. Marshall Field dreamed of a new store on State Street as he removed hay and dung from a brick barn and set up display counters. Potter Palmer would replace his grand hotel, the Palmer House, with millions in loans secured only by his good reputation. Cyrus McCormick, the Reaper King, vowed to rebuild his plant on a vaster scale.
Anthony Trollope, an Englishman, visited Chicago. He said, these businessmen in Chicago are reckless and they fail a lot, but failure doesn't bother them. Catastrophe doesn't bother them. They bounce right back. And that seems to be ingrained in the character of the city. The fire happens, and believe it or not, in the newspapers, it's seen as an opportunity. Chicago hops right to it after the fire and rebuilds itself in an astonishingly short period of time. It's about a 2-year period.
We didn't have a mythological past, so we're building one in 1871. To some degree, the city grows so quickly, and then it's creating a past and thinking about a past, and the fire provides a mythology. Chicago's going to rise out of the ashes, does arise out of the ashes. How much of the city is actually burned? Well, you know, only a small part of the actual city is burned, but that's not the way we think about the fire.
There was an outpouring of aid from around the nation and from 25 foreign countries. England sent 8,000 books.
And even Queen Victoria personally donated books and inscribed them to the people of Chicago. And they had assumed, of course, that in the Great Fire, Chicago would have lost its library. Well, there was only one problem. Chicago didn't have a library.
Years after the fire, a 17-year-old came to Chicago from Boston with dreams of becoming an architect. Though he found the buildings unimpressive, he was impressed with the recovery. Young Lewis Henry Sullivan, who had dropped out of MIT after a year, got, he said, a sense of big things to be done.
He wrote his autobiography about stepping off the train seeing the city before him, part of it still in ruins from the fire, and thrusting his hand up in the air and saying, "This is the place for me."
The city shouted itself hoarse, Sullivan would write. "We are the crudest, rawest, most savagely ambitious dreamers and doers in the world." He would be one of them. Gustavus Swift would be another. Swift got his start as a teenage butcher on Cape Cod in Massachusetts.
The story my father likes to tell is that when Gustavus Swift was about 16 years old, he borrowed $20 from his father to buy a heifer. And then he slaughtered the heifer and went and sold it to local residents in the Cape and came back, and his father asked him, "How did you do?" He said, "Well, I sold the meat for $20. And his father said, "Well, you didn't make any money at it then?" He said, "Well, yes, I did. I sold the hide for $2. And the reason I like that story is that eventually he discovered that in the big picture, that in the livestock business, you didn't make money or much money selling the meat, but you made it in the byproducts.
Swift became a cattle dealer who followed the market west. In 1875, he moved his pregnant wife Anne and 5 children into a rented house near the Union Stockyards. He was so frugal, for 30 years he would not allow her to buy curtains until she threatened to leave. Even then, not for his bedroom. Swift wanted to be closer to the source of cattle. The source was nowhere near Chicago. It was more than 1,000 miles away in Texas. Later, it spread north, across the Great Plains to Montana. After the railroad reached Abilene, Kansas in 1867, cowboys began herding Texas longhorns north along the Chisholm Trail to the railhead. They were loaded on cattle cars bound for buyers in Chicago, like Gustavus Swift. Swift would revolutionize the beef industry, what Americans and much of the world ate, when they ate it, where they bought it, how little they paid for it. Once a luxury, he made beef affordable and commonplace. He bought his cattle at the Union Stockyards and shipped them east to butchers he knew in Massachusetts. But there were problems shipping live animals.
They have to be fed, they have to be watered, which they don't do very happily in a railroad car, which means that they're constantly losing weight. And many of these are animals with long horns, stuffed into cattle cars and gouging each other, so that a number of them will arrive wounded or dead by the time they reach their final destination. These are all reasons not to want to ship live animals.
Gustavus Swift was shipping via the railroad steers that weighed about 1,000 pounds. He only was able to sell 600 pounds of that animal through the meat. And so there was 400 pounds that was just costing him money.
Swift decided to slaughter the cattle in Chicago and ship only the dressed beef east. In that decision, he took risks greater than any Chicago entrepreneur had ever taken.
If you're not going to ship live animals, how are you going to ship the beef so that it doesn't rot along the way? And there, the answer to the riddle has already been provided by the pork packers in the 1850s. This immense network of ice storing places that cut ice in the winter from Indiana to Wisconsin, delivered it to Chicago. If you could simply get that ice into railroad cars, insulate those cars, and then send a jet of cold air across whatever the contents of the railroad car would be, you could ship any meat anywhere in the country without it rotting.
Ice loaded in Chicago would not last to New York. This forced Swift into the ice business. He created 5 depots along the tracks. Every ton of dressed beef needed a ton of ice at each of his 5 depots. The railroads he used for livestock had invested in cattle cars and charged by the pound. When Swift bought his own refrigerated cars, the railroads conspired against him. He retaliated by dropping their more direct route to New York that ran south of Lake Erie. Instead, he shipped through Canada to Montreal and then south to Boston and New York, arranging for ice along the way. For dressed beef, the longer trip didn't matter. Transportation was only the first challenge.
Americans were used to eating their beef fresh. They were used to pork being in a packed form, whether it was ham or bacon or salt pork or what have you. But the way they'd had beef up until this time was by going down to their local butcher who had slaughtered that cow the night before. And so the meat was still just within 24 hours of having been a living, pulsing animal. And Swift was asking them to buy beef that was at least a week old, which did not sound like healthy beef to most Americans.
New York butchers, Boston butchers, Philadelphia butchers don't want to carry this meat. In fact, they're giving it a bad rap. They're calling it embalmed meat. And they're really afraid of being put out of business.
Butchers in Fitchburg, Massachusetts told Swift they would not sell Swift-dressed beef if all Fitchburg were starving. "All right," Swift replied. "I'll feed Fitchburg myself." His response to a boycott by butchers in Lowell was the same.
The old man gets on a train, goes east, goes to Lowell, sets up a railroad siding, unloads a whole hell of a load of lumber, builds a butcher shop, hires a workforce, and drives a number of the local butchers out of business.
It is all right to lose money, Swift told his agents. Just don't let them nose you out. He hired many of the bankrupt butchers as distributors of Swift beef. His huge volume ensured low prices. Competition from other Chicago packers like Philip Armour forced prices lower still. So low that Swift and his competitors sold their meat at a loss. In 1889, it cost $48 to purchase a steer in Chicago, dress the meat, and ship it to New York. It sold there for $38. The Chicago packers earned their profits on the margin from what local butchers threw away.
Things that the local butcher had to give away because there just wasn't enough of them and there weren't enough customers for them to sell, could now be gathered into one location and turned into tons and tons of that material. You could hire scientists to figure out how to turn that material into soap or buttons or new forms of meat that had never been sold before.
Hides were tanned to leather. Hair stuffed cushions. Horns became combs. Guts, tennis racket strings. Tails, paintbrushes. Hooves, Jell-O. Nothing was wasted.
Gustavus Swift would walk out to Bubbly Creek, which was this terrible little sewer that ran out of one of his plants, with his top hat, his dark suit. He'd have his pants tucked into his Wellington boots, and he would wade into Bubbly Creek to check what was coming out of the sewer. And if he saw any grease or fat, then he knew that was waste, because you could have turned that into lard. And he'd go back and he'd find the source of how that happened and correct it. He was a very hands-on manager.
You can't understand industrial capitalism without understanding the importance of the pennies, half cents, a tenth of a cent, a hundredth of a cent. And when you think about millions of pounds of beef being processed through a single plant in a year, you begin to understand why a hundredth of a cent was something that kept Swift and Armour and other industrialists up at night.
There were two ways packers could cut costs: speed up the process and slash wages. They did both. In 1884, Each of the most skilled workers, the splitters, split 32 carcasses a day. 10 years later, each split 75, double the work, for less pay. It took 15 minutes from the kill to the chill room. Low-paid immigrants from Eastern Europe, even children, replaced the skilled butchers. More than 150 people would each do a small, routine job. When skilled Irish or German workers went on strike, Swift and Armour quickly replaced them. Cars packed with dressed beef heading east passed immigrants heading west in what were little better than cattle cars. Scandinavians, Poles, Lithuanians. Many settled back of the yards in Packingtown. Four-room apartments would house families of 12. Often a boarder slept in a bed while another worked a different shift. By the 1890s, Packingtown had become the vilest slum in Chicago. One boundary was the largest garbage dump in the city. Children played there, and women scavenged.
One of the aldermen said, "Hey, that whole neighborhood smells. Where are we going to put garbage dumps if we don't put it there?" You know, I mean, it was beyond his comprehension that anybody would complain. Because here you had Bubbly Creek, which was this open sewer for northern boundary. You had the stockyards, which left off this odor. And then you had this garbage dump. And then the railroad yards along south where children would get killed all the time as they were trying to cross the lines to go to school.
There was a big place called the hair field there, where they kept the hair, from some of the animals to dry out in the fields. They had these enormous sewerage ditches there. Men often drown in the sewerage ditches. They get drunk at a local shebang, they get down there, they fall into the ditch. Even the lawyer, Armour's lawyer, said the best thing you can do with the yards is burn them down. Even his lawyer said that.
There were hundreds of saloons back of the yards, 3 on every block. Many were on Whiskey Row at the gate of the stockyards.
When the bell rang at 12, men would run out to Whiskey Row, which was the major street just to the west of the stockyards, and they would get a beer and a shot, and then they could have a free lunch. So there'd be usually huge steam tables in these taverns in which they'd come in, and there you had your, pickled hog's feet and your eggs and your Polish sausage and your ham and whatever. You'd make a sandwich and you'd eat and you'd go back into the packing houses.
The saloons on Whiskey Row served everyone. On the side streets, the saloons were strictly ethnic. A Polish newspaper recounted the fate of a drunken German who wandered into a Polish tavern.
The newspaper article reports that something magical had happened. A bottle had come to life. It hit the German on the head and dragged him out and left him in the sewer, and then jumped back up on the bar. And there were various witnesses who said this is exactly what happened. And the bottom line of the article was, drink in your own bars. And I think that was very true. If a Pole had walked into an Irish tavern or a German tavern, God help the Jew who walked into any tavern on those streets, there would have been a clash.